Welcome to the deep dive. Today, well, our mission is a really essential one if you're navigating the sometimes complex world of HR. We're doing a comprehensive SPHR study session. It's focused on total rewards compliance and, those crucial U.S. compensation laws. We're going to break down 5 absolutely vital areas: the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, then ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, COBRA for health coverage continuation, the Affordable Care Act's employer requirements, the ACA, and finally the Equal Pay Act, EPA, and that includes modern pay equity stuff too. So we'll define important terms, look at the HR implications, highlight those common SPHR exam pitfalls, the tricky bits, and even work through some scenarios. It's all designed to help you really lock this content in.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember just how interconnected these laws are. Getting a handle on them isn't just about ticking a box on an exam. It's really about protecting employees and protecting your organization, too, from some pretty significant legal and financial headaches. Understanding those nuances is just critical for keeping things compliant and fair.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with that first foundational law, the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Yeah, it's the bedrock for so much of what we do in HR, right? It sets the federal minimum wage, overtime pay rules, record-keeping requirements, and child labor standards across the U.S. Now, coverage. It applies to most enterprises with annual sales of $500,000 or more, plus specific places like hospitals, schools, government agencies, regardless of their sales figures. The federal minimum wage, well, it's been $7.25 an hour since July 2009. But, and this is key, if your state law mandates a higher wage, you must pay that higher rate. Always. We've got a little mnemonic to help remember the FLSA basics. 7.25, 40, 1.5. So that's the $7.25 minimum, the 40-hour standard work week, and then 1.5 times regular pay for overtime hours.
That mnemonic nails the basics. But a really critical distinction, especially for the SPHR exam, is knowing the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees. Your non-exempt employees. They're fully covered by minimum wage and overtime rules. Simple enough. Exempt employees, though, they are, like the name suggests, exempt from the overtime provisions. But there are strict tests for that. So to qualify as exempt, an employee usually has to meet 2 main criteria. First, they need to be paid on a salary basis currently that's at least $684 per week. And second, their job duties have to meet specific tests. You often hear these called the white-collar exemptions. Things like executive managing a department, directing at least 2 staff. Administrative doing office work directly related to management, professional needing advanced knowledge like a doctor or lawyer, outside sales, and certain computer roles too. But here's a huge pitfall. Job titles alone mean nothing. Seriously, having manager in your title doesn't automatically make you exempt if you're spending most of your time doing the same work as the people you supervise. Getting this wrong, misclassifying someone, that can be incredibly costly. We're talking up to 3 years of back overtime pay, plus penalties. Which really underlines why documenting your exemption analysis, writing down why you classified someone as exempt, is so crucial for HR departments.
That's a massive point about documentation, definitely. Okay, let's test this with a kind of SPHR style scenario. Imagine Jamie. She's a computer programmer, paid a salary of $1,000 per week, and she regularly works 50 hours. Now, the trap here is thinking, oh, she's salaried, so she must be exempt. Right, but that's often false if she doesn't meet those specific duties tests we just mentioned. So let's assume for this example that Jamie is actually non-exempt. How do we calculate her correct pay for that 50-hour week? Okay, first step is her regular rate of pay. That's her $1,000 salary divided by all 50 hours she worked. So $1,000 divided by 50, that's $20 per hour. That's her regular rate. Now for overtime, she worked 10 hours over 40. So her overtime pay is 10 hours times her overtime rate. The overtime rate is 1.5 times her regular rate, so 1.5 times 20 is $30 per hour, so 10 hours times $30, that's $300 in overtime pay. You add that to her regular $1,000 salary. Her total gross pay for that week should be $1,300. And this really shows that understanding the method of calculation is what's critical, both for the exam and, for actual compliance. Okay, so from those basic wage laws, let's pivot a bit. Let's talk about how employee benefits are governed, specifically with ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. Now, ERISA doesn't actually require employers to offer retirement or health plans, but, and this is the big but, if they do choose to offer them, ERISA sets some pretty strict rules. It mainly governs private sector retirement plans like 401ks and welfare benefit plans like health insurance. Its main goal, protecting the plan participants, us employees.
That's exactly right. And one of ERISA's core pieces is about disclosure. Plan administrators have to provide key information clearly in writing. This includes the summary plan description, or SPB. Think of it as the plan's rulebook. It explains benefits, who's eligible, vesting schedules, how to file claims, all that. And it has to be given free of charge to every participant when they join the plan. Then if the plan terms change significantly, participants get a summary of material modifications, an SMM, and annually there's also a summary annual report, the SAR. This basically summarizes the plan's financial report, which is filed on Form 5500. Beyond just disclosure, ERISA imposes really strict fiduciary duties. Anyone who has discretionary control over plan assets, deciding on investments, for instance, they have to act solely in the best interest of the participants, period. They need to exercise prudent judgment, act wisely, and diversify investments to minimize risk. This is where HR often gets involved, maybe in vetting the plan trustees or monitoring the fees charged to participants. We also have the PBGC, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation.
It acts like an insurance company for certain defined benefit pension plans and traditional pensions. If the employer goes bankrupt, PBGC steps in. Important note, though, it does not cover defined contribution plans like 401k. What's interesting here, though, is how thinking strategically about ERISA compliance, like having a really well-managed 401k with clear disclosures and strong oversight, that can actually be a big plus for attracting talent. It builds trust. It shows you care about your employee's financial future.
That's a great strategic point, but yeah, compliance has to come first. For the SPHR exam, some common ERISA pitfall, or forgetting to update and distribute those SPDs when things change, is a big one. Also, just misunderstanding which plans ERISA actually covers. It generally covers funded welfare benefit plans. Think health, life, disability insurance provided through the employer, but maybe not all voluntary benefits unless they're set up as part of a formal ERISA plan. It can get tricky. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about a critical piece of benefits continuation. COBRA. The Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Basically, COBRA gives employees and their families the right to continue their group health coverage for a limited time after something called a qualifying event happens, like losing a job. It applies to employer-sponsored group health plans, specifically those offered by private employers who have 20 or more employees.
Yeah, the specifics here are really important to nail down. First, who's a qualified beneficiary? That's anyone covered by the health plan the day before the qualifying event occurs. Could be the employee, spouse, dependent children. And what are those qualifying events? Well, things like termination of employment, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, unless it was for gross misconduct. That's the key exception. Other events include a reduction in hours that causes loss of coverage, the death of the covered employee, divorce or legal separation, a dependent child aging out of coverage, or the employee becoming entitled to Medicare. Now, the length of COBRA coverage, it varies. For most qualifying events, like losing your job or having hours reduced, the standard period is 18 months. However, if a second qualifying event happens during that initial 18 months, say the terminated employee gets divorced, then the spouse and dependents might be eligible for an extension, up to a total of 36 months from the original event. There's also an 11-month extension if someone is determined disabled by Social Security during the first 60 days of COBRA, bringing their total possible coverage up to 29 months. And the cost? Well, the beneficiary usually pays the full premium plus up to a 2% administrative fee, so up to 102% of the plan's cost. For that disability extension period, the premium can go up to 150% for months 19 through 29. And don't forget the notice requirements. They are super critical. Employers generally have 30 days to notify the plan administrator after a qualifying event like termination occurs. Then, the plan administrator has 14 days to send the election notice out to the qualified beneficiary, explaining their rights. Missing these deadlines, that can cause big problems for employers, potentially extending their obligation to offer coverage.
Yeah, those notice deadlines sound like prime SPHR exam material. Huge potential liability there. Common COBRA pitfalls to watch out for. Well, assuming COBRA applies to all employee benefits as one, it generally only applies to group health plans, medical, dental, vision, not usually things like life insurance. Also, remember that 20 employee threshold? Federal COBRA doesn't apply to smaller employers, although many states have their own mini COBRA laws that might cover smaller groups, so you always need to check state law too. Okay, let's run through a quick scenario. Maria is 35. She's involuntarily terminated from her job at a company that has 25 employees. She had health coverage through work. So how long can she continue her coverage under COBRA, and roughly what will she pay? Well, the company has more than 20 employees, so federal COBRA applies. Termination is a qualifying event. So Maria can elect to continue her coverage for up to 18 months, and she'll have to pay the premium, potentially up to 102% of what the plan costs. The company's main responsibility here is getting that election notice to her promptly. And just to layer on that complexity, if Maria, say, got divorced 6 months after her termination while she was on COBRA, that divorce would be a second qualifying event for her now ex-spouse. That could extend the ex-spouse's COBRA eligibility up to 36 months from Maria's original termination date. See how it layers. All right, next up, the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, and specifically its employer mandate provisions. Under the ACA, there's this employer mandate, sometimes called shared responsibility or pay or play. It applies to employers who are defined as an applicable large employer, or ALE. An ALE is basically any employer that had an average of 50 or more full-time employees, including full-time equivalents, FTEs, during the previous calendar year. And for ACA purposes, full-time means averaging 30 or more hours per week or 130 hours per month. That's different from the FLSA's 40-hour standard for overtime, so we've got to keep those separate.
Right, that 30-hour definition is key for the ACA. And once you're identified as an ALE, there are specific coverage requirements you have to meet to avoid penalties. First, you have to offer minimum essential coverage, or MEC, to at least 95% of your full-time employees and their dependent children up to age 26. Notice spouses aren't required for this calculation. Second, the coverage you offer must be affordable. This generally means the employee's contribution for self-only coverage can't exceed a certain percentage it adjusts annually, but it's roughly 9.5% of their household income. There are some safe harbors employers can use to test this affordability. And third, the coverage has to provide minimum value. This means the plan has to cover, on average, at least 60% of the total allowed costs of benefits expected to be incurred under the plan. Now, if an ALE fails to meet these requirements, they can face those pay-or-play penalties. There are two main types. Penalty A, sometimes called the sledgehammer penalty, hits if an ALE doesn't offer MEC to at least 95% of its full-time employees and their dependents, and at least one full-time employee gets a premium tax credit or subsidy on the ACA marketplace. That penalty is calculated based on the employer's total number of full-time employees, minus a statutory exclusion, currently 30 employees, times an indexed dollar amount. It can get very expensive very quickly. Then there's penalty B, the tack hammer penalty. This applies if the ALE does offer coverage to at least 95% of full-timers, but the coverage offered isn't affordable, or doesn't provide minimum value, or maybe wasn't offered to a specific employee who then goes and gets a marketplace subsidy. Penalty B is calculated differently. It's an indexed dollar amount multiplied only by the number of full-time employees who actually received a subsidy. It's usually less severe than penalty A, but still significant. Honestly, the sheer complexity of calculating ALE status, tracking offers of coverage, applying affordability safe harbors, and figuring out potential penalties. It makes careful tracking and administration absolutely critical for HR. We came up with a mnemonic for this one too. 50 to play, 95% to stay, 26 at play. Helps remember the 50 employee threshold for being an ALE, the 95% coverage requirement to avoid penalty A, and covering dependents up to age 26.
That's a great mnemonic. 50 to play, 95% to stay, 26 at play. Perfect for those key numbers. Common ACA pitfalls. Definitely miscounting employees, especially getting tripped up on how to calculate those full-time equivalents, the FTEs. That can push an employer over the 50 threshold unexpectedly. Another trap is confusion around dependent coverage, remembering it's children under 26 for the mandate calculation, not necessarily spouses, although plans often cover spouses too. Let's try an example. Say Acme Corp consistently had 48 full-time employees all last year. This year, they hire an intern whose hours push their total full-time equivalent count up to 49 for this year. Is Acme subject to the employer mandate for next year based on this year's count? The answer is no, not yet. Even with that intern bumping them up to 49 FTEs, they're still below that magic number 50 based on this year's average. So for next year, they wouldn't be considered an ALE. See how precise that threshold is? Just one employee can make the difference. Now, a slightly different scenario. What if Acme did have, say, 60 full-time employees last year, making them an ALE for this year? They offer compliant coverage to 59 of them, that's over 95%, but they miss one employee. If that one missed employee goes to the marketplace and gets a subsidy, what happens? In that case, Acme would likely face penalty B. Why B and not A? Because they did offer coverage to at least 95% of their full-timers. But since the coverage wasn't offered to everyone and someone got a subsidy as a result, penalty B applies for that specific subsidized employee. Okay, deep breath. We've covered a lot. Let's round out our deep dive today with our fifth key area, fair compensation and the Equal Pay Act, or EPA. The EPA was passed way back in 1963, actually as an amendment to the FLSA we started with. Its purpose is pretty clear. Protect against sex-based wage discrimination for doing equal work. The core principle is simple on its face. Men and women doing substantially equal jobs within the same workplace must receive equal pay.
Exactly. And that phrase, equal work standard, is key. It means the jobs don't have to be absolutely identical, but they have to be substantially equal when you look at the overall job content. We assess this based on 4 factors: the required skill, the effort involved, the level of responsibility, and the working conditions under which the jobs are performed. So for instance, you might have a male senior analyst and a female lead analyst. If their actual day-to-day tasks, required skills, effort, and responsibilities are basically the same, and they work in similar conditions, the EPA says their pay should be equal, regardless of the slightly different titles. It's also important that this comparison happens within the same establishment, usually meaning the same physical location or maybe a distinct business unit. Pay differences across different cities might be justifiable due to geography, for example. And the EPA covers all forms of compensation, not just base salary or hourly wages. It includes bonuses, overtime pay, stock options, benefits, pretty much everything that's part of pay. And here's a crucial enforcement point.
If an employer finds an EPA violation, they must fix it by raising the pay of the lower paid person. They absolutely cannot lower the wages of the higher paid employee to achieve equality. That's illegal. However, the EPA does allow for pay differences between men and women doing equal work, if and only if the difference is based on one of 4 specific factors other than sex. These are the only legal defenses. They are: number 1, a bona fide seniority system; number 2, a merit system; number 3, a system that measures earnings by quantity or quality production, like piecework pay; or number 4, any other factor other than sex. That last one is a bit of a catch-all, but it has to be a legitimate business reason, like paying more for a night shift, shift differential, differences based on geography, maybe education or experience if it's truly relevant and applied consistently, things like that. We have another mnemonic for these EPA defenses. SMERF stands for seniority, merit, incentive, or sometimes quantity, quality of production, and residual factors, that factor other than sex category.
And beyond just strict EPA compliance, this whole area ties into the broader push for modern pay equity. That involves things like proactively conducting pay audits, establishing clear salary bands, being transparent about compensation practices. It's about fairness beyond just avoiding lawsuits.
That SMERF mnemonic is definitely handy for remembering those defenses. Seniority, merit, incentive, residual factors. Got it. Common pitfalls with the EPA. Probably the biggest one is comparing jobs that aren't actually substantially equal. The EPA is specific. It's about equal work. It doesn't address pay gaps between, say, a nurse and a truck driver, even if you think they should be valued similarly. That's a different discussion. So let's try an EPA example. Alice, who is female, is a software developer. Bob, who is male, works in the same department, same location, as a senior software developer. They actually have the same number of years of total experience, and their day-to-day programming tasks are almost identical. Alice finds out Bob makes 10% more than her. The company says the pay difference is because Bob holds the senior title and is paid according to their seniority pay scale. Is this okay under the EPA?
Well, it could be. If the company can genuinely demonstrate that they have a well-established, consistently applied, bona fide seniority system, and Bob's placement in that system accurately reflects his tenure or relevant experience compared to Alice's, resulting in the pay gap, then yes, seniority. The S in SMEF is a valid defense. But the burden of proof is entirely on the employer. They have to show the seniority system is real, it's the actual reason for the difference, and it's applied fairly without regard to sex. Just saying seniority isn't enough if the facts don't back it up, especially if their duties and actual experience are so similar.
Right, the employer has to prove that defense holds water. Okay, wow, we have covered a huge amount of ground today. I really hope these little nuggets of knowledge are sticking with you as you study. Let's do a super quick recap, just the absolute core takeaways for each law. FLSA, remember the basic $7.25 federal minimum, 1.5 times overtime for over 40 hours for non-exempt folks. Exempt status needs both the salary basis and meeting those duties tests. And yeah, misclassification, very, very costly, ERISA. If you offer retirement or welfare plans, think disclosure, SPDs, SARs. Think fiduciary duties, acting in participants' best interests. And Form 5500 annual reporting, COBRA. Kicks in for employers with 20-plus employees, offers 18 to 36 months of group health continuation after qualifying events. Beneficiaries pay up to 102% of the cost. Those notice deadlines are critical. ACA applies to applicable large employers, ALEs, that's 50-plus full-time or FTEs. They must offer affordable minimum value coverage to at least 95% of full-timers and their kids up to 26, or face penalties. Remember on mnemonic, 50 to play, 95% to stay, 26 at play. And finally, the EPA. Equal pay for substantially equal work in the same place. Pay differences are only okay if based on one of these SMIF defenses: seniority, merit, incentive production, or a residual factor other than sex. Getting these down isn't just about passing your SPHR exam, though it'll certainly help. It's really about being an effective, ethical, and frankly, legally compliant HR pro. That's exactly it. It's so vital to remember that, underneath all the rules and acronyms, these laws are fundamentally about creating workplaces that are fair, transparent, and compliant. And because things change, laws get updated, courts issue new interpretations. Continuous learning is just part of the job. It has to be. And always, always question assumptions, especially those common ones like, oh, they're salaried, they must be exempt, or they have different job titles, so the work can't be equal. Really apply critical thinking to make sure you're applying these rules correctly in your specific situation, not just reciting them from memory.
That's a really powerful thought to wrap up with. So as you move forward, whether you're deep in SPHR study mode or applying this back on the job tomorrow, maybe take a second to think about how these regulations, these things we've discussed today, aren't just lines in a textbook. They directly impact the financial well-being, the health security, the fundamental fairness experienced by real people every single day. So the question to leave you with is, how will you use this deeper understanding to really champion fairness and ensure compliance within your own organization?